Hi, Lou here to talk at some length about something I've observed in the last 20 years, and that is that 21st century gamers are usually deficient in military strategy. Now, I mean military strategy, not the strategy that people refer to when they say strategy games. Strategy games simply means a game where you need to think clearly and effectively to win, as opposed to family games, party games, kids games, and athletic wear games. Games where you're using athletic skills, whether it's the dexterity of flicking something or the dexterity of using a joystick and so forth. So military strategy is the strategy of maneuver and combat in games involving armed conflict, which is more than just war games. And I'm also referring to strategy, not tactics. Many conflict games are tactical. Skirmish games, most of role-playing games, combat is tactical. Collectible card games and other arena or wizard's duel games, squad, platoon, company, battalion games, even many games that are about individual set-piece battles, they are tactical. Strategy, and especially grand strategy, are about timing, patience, but especially the long term. Tactics are short term, immediate. So there's fundamental difference here. Planning is absolutely necessary in strategy, even though no plan entirely survives contact with the enemy. You keep revising the plan to meet changes in circumstances. In games, you have to picture and plan how you want the entire game to go, not just the next turn or the next couple turns. But in 21st century life, we're going away from planning to, quote, the spontaneous, unquote, to satisfying immediate desires. It's the age of instant gratification. Cell phones especially help us avoid any need to plan, because we just check things out on our cell phone. Where are we going to eat? Look up a restaurant on the cell phone. How are we going to meet up? Well, we'll just call each other. And it's amusing to hear stories of people who say, oh, we'll just call each other and that's the way we'll get together, but they're somewhere where the cell phone connections are not very good, and so they can't call each other. And of course, we're in the era of the acronym TL:DR, which stands for too long, didn't read. And yet we have lots of people who say TLDR and then express their opinion anyway, as though they did read it. It's ridiculous. So patience is required because it's about the long term. Sometimes the best play is to do nothing, which is not what contemporaries want to do. Sometimes preserving your forces is more important than eliminating enemies. Good strategists forego short-term benefit when they can get more long-term. It's not only about what's immediately evident. But that's not how people are brought up today. We live in the age of instant gratification and convenience. We live in an age of billboard ads saying patience used to be a virtue. Players learn from video game to always be doing something. They don't like to do nothing, quote unquote. It reminds me of a cartoon of two vultures sitting on a limb. One says, patience hell, I'm going to kill something. Well, you can take that attitude, but in a game of military strategy, that's going to hurt you. So strategy in sum is striving for long-term gain, not necessarily short-term, thinking far ahead, seeing what's going to happen well before it does, controlling or influencing what happens throughout the game. You can't be a passive player. You must be an active player. And yet, typical modern games are made for passive players. It's understanding who's ahead and who is not, even when it's not clear at all. But many players don't seem to pay attention to that in multi-sided conflict games. Of course, conflict games are not in style among gamers. They're not the sort of thing you get in Euro games or card games. I've even heard people call war games obsolete, which is, of course, ridiculous because history is not going to become obsolete, although the interest in history is much less than it used to be. At any rate, many post-baby boomers and especially under 30 people often don't play games that require military-style strategy acumen, so they don't learn to be good at it. My observation of regular game players is that they tend to be pretty deficient in military-style strategy. I remember one of my particular prototypes, Pleiades Cluster, a space war game, a space empires game. There was one college player, it was play tested by college players in this case, who understood the strategy. And he'd be playing, I'd be watching, and we would look at each other because we knew what was going to happen a round or two later, and the game only lasted 4 rounds. Nobody else did, and so they didn't act soon enough to, for example, pull back the leader. They just didn't see it. Of course, when you come down to it, most game players aren't very good players, period, these days. They don't devote enough attention to it. It's not important enough to them. Essentially, they're casual players. Well, what about video games? Well, you can't lose a typical video game, so nothing is actually important. It doesn't matter what you do. And so many players use the try lots of different ways, save each one, keep the best method. Well, that's not going to help you in military strategy in a game where you can't do that. Video games in general are about the short term, not the long term. Furthermore, most video war games, quote unquote, are actually resource management games. Hearts of Iron and so forth. If you manage your resources well, you overwhelm the enemy in actual fighting because you have better equipment, better units, and more of them because you've succeeded in the resource management phase better than your enemy. Now let's take an example from the real world. Adolf Hitler's big mistake was not in attacking Russia. That war may have been inevitable, but attacking when he did. Trouble in the Balkans in 1941 delayed the invasion. But even if it hadn't, Hitler should have waited until 1942. Unfortunately for him, his long-term goal was Lebensraum, living space, and he intended to take that from the Slavs, and he got in a hurry. In his book Mein Kampf, which is from the 1920s, he explained exactly that. So for a long time he had been aiming at invading the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, when he invaded the Soviet Union, Germany's economic and manpower advantage over their opponents was to a considerable extent lost. Now, keep in mind, grand strategy is about patience and timing, not about aggressiveness. How about a simple example from D&D? People in my D&D campaigns tend to do things differently than elsewhere. For example, take prisoners to gather information for longer-term planning. Running away from fights when there was no prospect for improving their strategic objective. That is, they don't just kill people for experience and loot. The hidden assumption in typical fantasy role-playing is that all combats will be sporting, fair. But if your campaign is a little more like a real war, as mine was and will be if I can find players who do it, then it's combat as war, not combat as sport. The objective in war is to persuade the enemy to surrender without you losing anyone. Or if they won't surrender, a one-sided massacre should ensue. And this, of course, includes the use of stratagems, trickery, to achieve your objectives. Now let's take the example of my game Britannia, very much a grand strategy game, as are most sweep of history games, given the scale and control by a player of several nations. It's not surprising I like grand strategy games. Typically, new players don't even see the long-term possibilities. I remember one new player playing the yellow, and when he got done, he didn't understand why he had lost by a big margin. It's because he hadn't even seen many of the possibilities, and that tends to happen with strategic and grand strategic games. Deep games in general require you to play some or to be really, really, really good to understand and see the objectives. So, what should Hitler have done in World War II? He should have cleaned the British out of Africa. Then he could take the Near and Middle East to secure his oil supplies and put him closer to Russia's oil supplies in the Caucasus, and then attack Russia in 1942. Ideally, he should have restrained the Japanese so that the USA got into the war later, but that was going to be very difficult because the Japanese were desperate. Remember, long wars are as much or more about economy as about the military. World War II was a war in which the Germans, or the Axis, had to do enough to become economically dominant before the big economy of their opponents was able to give their opponents a military advantage. And they failed. And that military advantage crushed them in the end. There were just too many planes, too many tanks, too much of everything, too many ships on the Allied side. Let's take an example from a video game. This came to me when I was playing Empire Deluxe Enhanced Edition, a game from 2004. It's an improvement of a late 90s game, which in turn was an improvement on a DOS game called Empire. Empire Deluxe, the late 90s game, is regarded as a classic. What I see in the computer opponents is what you see in anyone who is deficient in military strategy. The computer opponents don't have the long-term point of view. They only consider the immediate rather than the long term. They build a bomber, they send the bomber off to bomb something. They don't save it up. For example, at one point in the game, I pulled back a little bit, or perhaps I should say, I didn't continue to advance because I wanted the two opponents I was facing to fight each other. In the meantime, I could build up my forces. They obliged me quite happily and killed each other off. Of course, this is not exclusive to this old game. It's typically the problem with all computer opponents, or if you will, AI. They don't understand strategy well. They can be demons at tactics, but they're not good at strategy. Let's consider diplomacy, the game. You can see the importance of military strategy in a game like diplomacy. It has three elements. One is negotiation or diplomacy, two is strategy, and three is tactics. The tactics are often not very important when one side has a considerable preponderance. There is no chance in the game, but it is simultaneous movement. If the tactics are important, people can take a lot of time thinking about them. But regardless, if your strategy is deficient, then you're likely going to lose the game. Even if you're a good negotiator, if you don't negotiate the right things, you're going to lose much of the time. So, in a military strategy game, the feedback comes from units available and opposing units killed, from the economic situation, but especially from positioning on the board. Now, one way a designer can try to compensate for people who don't get the positioning on the board very well is victory points that can be awarded every turn to provide feedback for those who can't recognize feedback from positioning. But then we have the problem of intermediate goals. Something that helps you attain your ultimate goal, but itself isn't part of the victory conditions, is an intermediate goal. For example, dominating the center of the board in a game of chess. I play tested a game called Zombie Escape once at Origins, and there are zombies in the game. They cannot kill you, but they can force you back toward your origin and keep you away from getting out of the place you're trying to escape from. So I play tested this once with some guys, and one of them defeated a zombie, and he wanted a reward for it. He didn't understand or didn't see that it was a intermediate goal. He was used to the video game style that every time you defeat something, every time you do something, you get rewarded for it. Do those who are deficient in strategy fail to differentiate between intermediate and ultimate goals? I think sometimes yes. In contemporary games, the modern way to design games is to hold the hand of the players, to show them the path to victory. So there's little that they have to figure out the hard way. In video games, most designers always want to point out what the players should do next, so the players don't have to think strategically. Well, if you play those kinds of games, then you're going to be deficient in military strategy. The trend to shorter games contributes to this deficiency. There is no long term in a short game. Well, thanks for listening if you've gone this far.